on the land of the Dena'ina, and I thank our Indigenous brothers and sisters for shepherding this land for these many hundreds and hundreds of years. Next slide, please. So Celeste, that's where I had you in the program, but you kicked us on off nicely. Thank you very much. All right. Now, on to our panelists. We've put together a very wonderful panel of knowledgeable individuals for you this evening. And so without further ado, we're just going to go ahead here in order. I'd like to welcome Anne McKay Bryson. If you could please introduce yourselves to our audience.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of you. I was born and raised in Michigan and moved to Anchorage in 1979 to start my teaching career. I'm married to a former Anchorage Daily News journalist, proud mom of 3 daughters, one grandchild who's starting kindergarten this year in Anchorage, and another on the way any day now here in Boston. I worked for the Anchorage School District as a classroom teacher from 1979 to 2006. And then moved into supporting adults in the Anchorage School District through mentoring and induction work and the second order change adult SEL work until retiring 9 years ago. I continue my dedication to supporting effective, equitable, and joyful education through SEL Rising. My clients for that, I'm a consultant to CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, Emotional Learning, with Safe Alaskans in their out of school time work with adult SEL work, and also with Emory University as a collaborating author and editor in their C, social, emotional, and ethical learning curriculum. So thank you again, Kristina, for having me tonight.
Nice to have you, Anne. We'll move on to Mr. Cal Williams.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having this discussion, and thanks indeed. I'm humbly honored to be a part of it. My education began in the segregated South during school. The old people in my hometown used to always value education. Even those who were illiterate would say, boy, get something in your head and they can't take it out. You'd be walking down the street and old people would say, boy, what school you go to? As you grew older, they would say, boy, what college you going to? So that high expectation of us, colored children, as we were called then, led us to be driven. And then I was blessed to have some German Franciscan priests and nuns come and build a school just across from my house, just across the street. I had 12 years of education at that highly disciplined, high expectation, high encouragement, forgiving, but yet having high expectations. So my view on education is that it occurs in the classroom and in the community. Parents must be involved. We have discipline problems with parents who had bad experiences themselves in school and don't love school like my grandmother and my grandfather. So I'm encouraged to be a part of this new education process where we are now having to Zoom and do all these kinds of things. And I welcome, as I have done over the years, working with the schools. I've gone out to Wasilla, I've gone to Houston and elsewhere, because a lot of those kids out there never see an African American, especially with a necktie on. So education, I have been involved with in the school system, and I welcome the opportunity to continue.
Thank you. Moving on, we have Dr. E.J. David.
Hey, everybody. My name is E.J. David. I was born in the Philippines, and I moved to Utqiagvik, Alaska, which used to be called Barrow, Alaska, when I was 14 years old. My education started in the Philippines, and it is under an educational system that was highly influenced by the American educational system. And so right from the get-go, I had I was inculcated with certain views of American values and American standards of intelligence and so on. And so when I got to Utqiagvik when I was 14, I went to middle school and high school there. Um, and that's where I met my wife. My wife is a co-Yukon Athabascan woman from the village of Ruby by the Yukon River. And with her, together, we have 4 Filipino Athabascan children. And I say Filipino because that's the term that most people know. But the people who are from the country now known as the Philippines are actually very diverse. My ethnic group specifically is Kapampangan. I'm of the Kapampangan people. And, that means people of the riverbanks. And so my wife is from the Yukon River and my people are from the riverbank. So my family is full of river people. I am honored to be here. I look forward to our discussion today and I look forward to learning from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ. Mr. George Martinez.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to be with you all today. My name is George Martinez. I am an educator, a community entrepreneur, and a diplomat, and I'll be wearing those hats today. But I'm also a father of 2 young children, of 2 in the school district. So I have 2 young people in the school district here in Anchorage, and as my journey as an educator, I grew up originally in New York City, very multicultural, very diverse city. But even in that regard, finding the lane for access and being able for me to connect as the first person in my family to go on and graduate high school, let alone go on to college, graduate college and beyond. I was always looking for bridges of relevancy. And I brought that nature of my own journey into the work. And when I first actually stepped foot here in Alaska, it was as a cultural ambassador and an educator working with young professionals here, but specifically also bringing a relevant hip hop based curriculum into the school district that one of the organizations that I was a co-founder of and a founding member of developed. So I've been striving on this journey for myself and for my community for a while. Great to be here with everybody.
Thank you, George. Dr. Ian Hartman.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be on the panel with everybody. And I'm just honored to be in the presence of all of you for this discussion. I know it's going to be wonderful. A little bit about myself. I am a professor of history at UAA. I came to Alaska for what was supposed to be 1 year. I think it's a common story. This was back in 2011. And long story short, I've been here for about 10 years. And it's been a wonderful ride, but it's, of course, been up and down at the university. And I think my interest in this panel comes from just the general belief that Anchorage is a particularly wonderful place and diverse place. And too often our curriculum doesn't quite match up with the people who live in Anchorage, the people who live in Alaska. And so my background as an historian is on race, ethnicity, public policy. And so my research and my teaching kind of lie at this intersection of figuring out how it is that public policies can be sensitive to populations and diverse populations, and how we can better align our educational system with the needs of diverse constituencies, and how it is that we can kind of have our politics, I think, kind of reflect the diversity of our communities. And so that's my focus, I guess, coming into this. And just, I guess, on a more personal note, I also have worked with Cal since he's on this panel here. We're trying to build an archive of the history makers, and that's something that's ongoing. And I'll put in a plug for that. But we have some really wonderful Black history specifically in Anchorage, but also Alaska overall. And so one of the projects that we've been embarking on over these last couple of years is to really raise the profile of that and allow people to understand that Anchorage has this incredible history generally, but Black history specifically has just been very underrepresented. And I think if we can all partner to raise the profile of that, then we would have done something right. So that's just a little bit about me. But again, happy to be here and honored to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And last but certainly not least, Margo Bellamy.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. So I'm Margo Bellamy, and I'm a retired educator. And I guess I feel really blessed because education was not just a career for me. It's also the way that I serve others. And so I'm happy to be here tonight. I think I've probably held every position there is to hold in education. So I bring that perspective, a lot of perspectives to the panel. I also am a grandma, and I had 2 kids that went through the Anchorage School District. I'm here tonight as myself. I'm not representing the Anchorage School Board. However, that is one of the ways that I also serve. So I am looking forward to engaging. I really don't, I want to hear from everybody on the panel. I don't necessarily want to talk. So, but I'll do whatever the moderator tells me to do tonight. Thank you.
And that's rare because that's my mom. So she tells me what to do most of the time. So here we go. All right, great. And that cherub you heard in the background, of course, was my son. He's with Nani and Papa today. So thank you very much, Margo. All right. Well, for those who may have just joined, I'm Dr. Kristina Bellamy. I was born and raised here in Anchorage. I am an educator. I am also a very joyful disruptor of systems of oppression, the status quo, and things that continue to create barriers for learning and opportunity for people of underrepresented communities. Also, I am the mother of a brown little boy, and that is my passion, and that is why I continue to fight and do the work that I do. So let's jump into our content. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to really just ground ourselves in a working definition of cultural responsiveness for this evening's panel. So Cambridge is very clear that they define culturally responsiveness as the ability to understand and consider the cultural backgrounds of the people that you teach or that you provide services to. So in this respect, our definition of cultural responsiveness is not just pinned in education, it is actually pinned in human interaction and experience, right? If we follow Cambridge's definition. One that I truly appreciate here from the National Center for Cultural Responsive Education Systems is such that it is the ability to learn from, right? And to relate respectfully with people, not only from your culture, but from those around as well. I think the key here for me as an educator is the ability to learn from. It is a two-way street. We have never arrived when we talk about work that is culturally responsive, culturally agile. We've never, ever arrived. We get very, very close, and it is an iterative process that we continue on over and over again. Okay, next slide. And so what we'll be talking about today is how this learning from the cultures around us and the people that we provide service to or that are in our care is around this movement called Black Lives Matter. Now, there's a lot of information out there, I would say misinformation about what Black Lives Matter is, how it originated, what its message is. So we're going to go right to this brief video here so that we can get some education on how this movement began.
These were their last words. Their names define a movement. Their deaths a rallying cry for justice. The killing of George Floyd has protesters demanding change, led by Black Lives Matter once again.
It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
Black Lives Matter group has been fighting to be heard since 2013, and the phrase itself is now being seen on streets and screens all over the world. But how did the movement get here? How did it begin? Their message comes from an urgent need to tackle police brutality, and the statistics are stark. Police killed more than 1,000 people in America in 2019. Black people are currently 3 times more likely to be killed by police, and 99% of killings by a police officer between 2013 to 2019 have not resulted in criminal charges. But the Black Lives Matter bubble didn't actually start with police brutality. It began after the death of Trayvon Martin at the hands of an armed vigilante.
It is the story that no one can stop talking about, the shooting of Trayvon Martin.
On a February evening in 2012 in Sanford, Florida, Neighborhood Watch volunteer George Zimmerman called the police to report a suspicious person.
This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. It's raining and he's just walking around looking about.
Okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic?
He looks black.
He's told not to approach the person in question.
Are you following him?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't need you to do that.
Zimmerman ignored the instructions and started following 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Moments later, neighbors reported hearing gunfire.
There's gunshots. You just heard gunshots?
Yes.
How many?
This one.
Zimmerman accepted he shot Martin, claiming self-defense. He wasn't immediately charged. In fact, it took 44 days for him to be arrested, only after national media attention, a petition signed by more than 1 million people, and a public response from the then president.
You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. We're going to get to the bottom of exactly what happened.
A year later, Zimmerman was found not guilty of all charges by a jury of 6 women, 5 of them white. The acquittal caused outrage and sparked the birth of a new kind of civil rights movement.
Long before there was a Black Lives Matter movement, there was a movement for Black lives.
It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you.
BLM from its beginning was the continuation of a tradition and a remix of a much longer Black freedom struggle, but it has its roots in the labor of Black women.
After Zimmerman's acquittal, activist Alicia Garza posted on Facebook, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter. Black lives matter." Garza's friend Patrice Couleur shared the final 3 words as a hashtag. On the 7th of March 2013, Black Lives Matter was first seen on Twitter. Writer and immigrant rights activist Opal Tometi offered to build social media platforms for it, where activists could connect with one another.
With this hashtag, new conversations were being created online and ultimately in our everyday lives.
Black Lives Matter is our call to action. It is a tool to reimagine a world where Black people are free to exist, free to live. It is a tool for our allies to show up differently for us.
The movement gained popularity.
All right. Thank you so much. So that is just for all of us a grounding in this movement that we're going to be talking about in context of being culturally responsive from Black Lives Matter. Next slide, please. So we're going to start the portion of our panel with questions from our panelists. I'm going to ask that our audience please put questions in the chat as they come up for you. We will get to those at the end. We really want to monopolize the knowledge and of our panelists that we've put together. So if you would please enter your questions in the chat. As we wrap up at the end, we'll start to take them at that time. Okay. All right. So this question is actually for all panelists. And remember, guys, this is a conversation. So as much as I'm going to try to direct some questions to certain panelists, please let me know, hey, Kristina, I want to add something to that, or if you have a thought that comes a little bit later on, then chime in, please. But for our panelists, in your context and work, what does cultural responsiveness mean to you? We'll go ahead and start with Margo, since I see you in the square first.
Sure. So in the context of my work and my life, cultural responsiveness means that I am aware, I'm understanding, and that I am forever trying to, I don't know everything there is about everybody's culture, but I absolutely try very hard to understand and to be respectful and understanding.
Thank you. Let's go to Anne.
Well, my daily work, I would say that cultural responsiveness is both a mindset and intentional practices in teaching that recognize the importance of including students' cultures in every aspect of learning, building on individual and cultural experiences and on students' prior knowledge and what they bring with them to the educational community. It's really, what do students know and care about? How do they see this reflected in their school community and in our classroom practices? How are they fully supported to bring their whole selves into the school community with a confidence that this will be very much welcomed and relished? This requires that all of us and each of us be culturally competent and have a deep awareness of our own cultural identity and our own views about differences, and embracing our own ability to learn and build on the wide variety of cultural and community norms that our students and those who care for them bring to school with them.
Thank you. EJ.
Yeah, so for me, as a professor, being culturally responsive means listening to my students and trying my best to know and understand not just current events and how the current climate might be impacting my students, but also the history. The history of what many of my students and their ancestors and their communities may have gone through. And also understanding that, it's impossible for me to know everything about my students. And so reminding myself that I need to remain humble. So cultural humility, I think, is an important aspect of my work. To always remember that I am perpetually learning. But at the same time, make sure that I do not put the responsibility of having to educate me and having to teach me on my students. So reminding myself that I need to continue doing the work.
Thank you. Cal.
Well, currently I attend St. Anthony's Catholic Church. We've got a Filipino priest, a Samoan choir, a white folk choir. I lead the gospel Filipino choir. So we're surrounded. We got Sudanese and everybody, and we do immigrations work there. I'm imbued in cultural interchange constantly, currently. When I first got to Alaska, shortly after getting to Alaska, I was a supervisor over Julius Pleasant, a strong, articulate, and well writer. He wrote for the Anchorage Times, native gentleman who gave me a crash course in cultural exchange. And particularly, one of the greatest things that I learned was to allow silence, thoughtfulness, and pause between words.
Thank you, Cal. George.
Yes, thank you. I think about this question with respect to the nature of my diplomatic work and how really cultural responsiveness is the foundation of being able to build authentic connections across differences, across diverse communities. So I think about it from that perspective, and then through the work of the Alaska Humanities Forum, where I'm the director of leadership programs and youth programs. The Humanities Forum is really focused on creating and growing community through connections, and the idea of creating space for where those connections could live. Really rely on being authentic, and on also relying on that not being lazy. When I think of bringing cultural responsiveness work to work, it really is about like the nature of recognizing that we don't need to try to force square pegs into round holes, or use that as an analogy anymore. That we can actually be thoughtful and make sure that the young people or the communities that we engage with are heard, seen, and respected in the way curriculum, in the way lessons are built, in the way the invitation to participate in the exchange of ideas are. So that's the context of my current work and the way I see this question.
Here, here, here.
Thank you. And Ian.
Thanks. Yeah, like EJ, I am at the university, and UAA, for those who aren't maybe as familiar with the institution, it's an open enrollment institution, which creates this really wonderful opportunity to work with students from all backgrounds, socioeconomic status, all ages. I mean, there truly is a diversity of students in any number of ways. And I think to approach cultural responsiveness to me is to kind of, one, to recognize my own privilege walking into the classroom, frankly, kind of where I'm coming from in my own kind of education and my pathway through life, and understanding that very often the students I am teaching have maybe are doing things differently than I have done them. And that's important, I think, to recognize. And the students need to see representation in the curriculum, I think, and there needs to be a sense of empowerment. And so in the day-to-day, I think that really means as a faculty member to ensure that students feel as though they're represented, they feel as though that they can relate to the material, and you also have to demonstrate empathy. I think something as basic as understanding that students are some of them are going to have had some rough patches, and you have to understand that. Some of them are going to be able to coast through just fine, and frankly, it doesn't really matter who's at the front of the classroom. They're going to be ready to go. And so I think that's been my primary instinct, I guess, with cultural responsiveness, is to just be very acutely aware of the way in which the students are going to relate to the college experience, but also how that experience is really shaped by a whole kind of installation of their backgrounds, where they're coming from, what they've experienced in life. And that's something that I try to be quite mindful of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you all for the panelists. I'm jotting down these words that keep coming up in various ways in your responses. Words such as humble or humility, active, right? So being culturally responsive requires action, whether that action is learning more for yourself. I heard someone say to create space within those structures within your care, to be able to have people feel seen and heard and included. And then Cal, if we go to the next question, I'm going to start with you for this question, because you talked about intentional, being very intentional. And, I consider you to be one of the, knowledge bearers of the African American experience in the state of Alaska. I mean, you've been here for a time and have spent a great deal of your career advocating and intentionally elevating the needs of Black Alaskans and people that find themselves here. So talk to me about how cultural barriers show up in your work and your learning, and give us an example of that.
Well, one of the quickest that I can bring is that I was director of the Neighborhood Crime Watch program, and I was the boss. And I was up at night working and trying to figure out how to do the FICA and the FUTA and keep my employees paid. And I had one employee who only acknowledged me as the boss when I was handing him a check. Any other time that I suggested or asked him to do something, he would have a different way of doing it or a better way of doing it. He could never, ever in his mind and his privilege, if you will, accept a Black man as his boss and as being in charge. So that was the systemic racism that I faced more than, work than getting from employers was this racism coming from my employee. That's that's about as blatant as I can tell you about it.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And so what I'm wondering, EJ, is in this context of a cultural barrier in a learning environment, how have you seen that show up at the university level in your experience?
Yeah, thank you. So for me, generally, I see it in that we in the university, and not just UAA, but I think universities generally, we all try to live up to a set of Western-based requirements and criteria. We try to, especially as people of color, we try to survive and thrive in a system that has equated intelligence with really the knowledge of what white folks have determined to be important. It is a system that arose from Western values, many of which, are not natural to me. And in fact, many of them are contradictory to the values of my own culture. So for example, in this context, we value competition versus collaboration. We encourage our students, to stand out versus, versus moving together, as a group, So as a professor, a little bit more specific here, as a professor, my promotion, my tenure is based on, the number of publications that I get. And so, the systems are not made to reward and encourage work that is based on establishing long-term relationships and trust with the communities that we work with. So as you provided earlier with the definition of cultural responsiveness, the systems in universities really are not made to reward work that is culturally responsive, work that is about learning from and respectfully relating with people. Instead, what is rewarded are research that is quick, right? Because you need to publish fast. And many times that kind of work is not the most culturally grounded and appropriate, right? So that's a specific example there. And yeah, so I'm going to stop there. I don't want to take too much time.
No. So George, I saw your head nodding and I was going to pivot somewhere else, but I want you to say, what are you thinking as EJ makes those statements?
Yeah, no, I was thinking of the specifically with respect to education and in that context of a classroom, just the nature of the purpose of the classroom. So as EJ was talking about and thinking of the work that educators have to do and that we're encouraging to do, I'm just thinking of the purpose of that classroom, like so that the barrier of an educator, if they're focused on making sure that people are driven into boxes, into a normative culture, then I think that we limit growth and authentic growth of an individual. So as an educator, I think to myself, well, if my intention is to really help develop the conditions for authentic growth, for a real learning opportunity for everyone in the learning space, then I think to myself that the value of again, and go back to not being lazy and making sure people are seen, heard, and understood is paramount, and it becomes not optional, right? Because it's not an optional thing to be effective as an educator in my mind. It should be paramount as the intention, and effectiveness comes from the bridge of understanding, essentially, to being able to deliver content and being able to grow from the response of students. So I just think of that nature of the intention of the classroom, and a lot of that is we have to question with respect to how we reorganize the classroom to get the most impact of growth for our students.
So that is really, next slide, please. So that leads me into my next slide, which actually brings this real moment where that's scary, George. Like what you're talking about, that's scary because that requires me to be vulnerable in a way that I may or may not be comfortable with, right? Vulnerable in that I don't know. Right. Maybe maybe my privilege has not allowed me to experience anything different than what I know. Right. So how do I create space for something that right? So here's the next one. And Margo, I'm going to come to you first for this one. So race and identity are important elements in not just teaching and learning and working, but really like in life. That we've talked about what cultural responsiveness is, but what kind of strategies or practices or advice would you give, I will say humans, not just educators or employers, right? And I really want you to come at this. I know for many years you were the executive director of Equal Opportunity for the school district. You've worked closely with the Equal Rights Commission. You were a trainer for the National Coalition Building Institute. Help lead us off with this with a response. What are you thinking with this question?
So really what comes up, it's a great question. What comes up for me is a couple of things. I think the first thing is that we have to be very careful that we don't, we have the legal protections that we have under the law. All right, those we are protected by law from being discriminated against, being harassed, whether that's in school or in the workplace. But that is not that can't be the only thing that drives how we treat each other. And so I think a lot of businesses or employers will go with the legal, and they don't really look to even consider what makes the individual the individual. So there's a question in the chat about race. A gentleman asked about race. The difference between race and culture. Whether you are sitting in a classroom or whether you are an emerging learner, or whether you are in a work environment, your race and your identity, you don't get to leave it at the door. You don't get to, but we require kids to step into classrooms that are not focused on them, on who they are. All right. Classrooms are part of a bigger institution, but it's the teachers and those employees or employers who have to go beyond just making sure that people have, that they're employed or they're getting educated. Because how I learn is so attached to my identity. And if I don't see myself, if I don't see successful people who look like me around me, I'm not saying I can't be successful or kids can't be successful. But so my advice, long story short, would be to pay attention to what is happening around you. Pay attention to who is represented in your circle, in your classroom, in your office. But then also recognize who's missing. That for me is the most important piece. It's not just who shows up, but who is missing. And so then if we are really culturally responsive, and if we are really trying to create environments where people are valued, respected, and where they want to belong, then we would do things a little bit differently, I think, in our
okay. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about who's missing.
Yes, please do.
In the Anchorage School District, the person or people that are missing are people who look like the students. The students don't see in the staff and administration themselves. When I went to school, I saw Black principals and Black educators, though I went to a Catholic school, as I told you before, where all of my teachers were white nuns, white priests. All of the students were Black. But in the community, somebody asked about what is the difference in race and culture. I'm Black, well, or was colored or Negro or whatever back in those days, but my grandmother was more economically advantaged than my father's mother was more economically advantaged than my mother's mother. So there were two cultures right there. My grandmother on my father's side was highfalutin and a practical nurse and lived on the north side of town. My grandmother on the other side was poor and lived in an alley. In that alley, I learned a great deal about collaboration and all those people pulling together with 2 outhouses among 10 buildings and 2 hydrants among 10 to do. I saw those people slaughter a hog and share the meat. I learned the culture down in that alley that I didn't learn up on Briard Street. So I'm Black, but I had 2 cultures running through me, and then Catholicism across the street, Franciscan order saying you don't suck up to nobody and you don't look down on anybody. So you develop your culture from the surroundings. And what we need in the school district is, if not teachers, lay people of different ethnic backgrounds having access to the students. We need more Black males, and I don't want to get sexist, but those students need to see Black males. I go into those schools out in those hinterlands just for that purpose. They might have 1 Black student in Palmer, but it's an advantage for those white students to see me standing there with a necktie on.
And it's experience, right? It's an experience as well as the connection, right? The very human part of what we're talking about ultimately is human connection, and how we do that in a way that is humble, that is inviting, is welcoming, that comes from a place of not knowing, right? But having an experience with others. So
Kristina?
Absolutely. Yes. I want to actually, so go ahead.
I just wanted to chime in on just a thought as well about, again, back to intentionality of the role of educators and the idea of being effective. I think is really important. So I wanted to point out that, like, the Humanities Forum, for example, we participate in a C3 program, creating cultural competency. And this is particularly for teachers who are coming into rural Alaska from an outside context. And the point of the C3 program and that creating cultural competency is to provide a better opportunity for the teachers to thrive in their environment, for the students to get out of it. But we also see the effectiveness. So I just wanted to point out that there's data that can show effectiveness at a system level. So we just don't have to leave it anecdotally.
Right.
Teachers who are 3 times more likely to stay for another year in rural Alaska teaching and thrive in that role if they have a foundation that gives them some core cultural competency learning earlier, prior to going into these communities where there is this such great difference of experience and cultural backgrounds. So there's a functionality to it that I want to make sure that folks who are listening also can recognize. There are ways to evaluate the effectiveness of these strategies in both the learning outcomes and then the retention of students and faculty.
And faculty. Yes, that is very important. Next slide. We're moving right along, and couldn't have planned this any better. You guys are falling right in line with where my thought process was when we were trying to create some questions. So we've now, talked about, many things, personal experiences. We've talked about the advisement that we could give. I want to really start to talk about actually kind of some of the psychological and historical importance of being able to access one's kind of true and authentic history and culture. And EJ, I'm going to start with you. You had talked about, shared some of your upbringing and some of the different constructs, westernized constructs, particularly at the university level. So how could that learning and those experiences that you talked about, how could that help shift our institutions or help shift the some thinking that we may have as individuals?
Well, just to contextualize this in a much larger way, to begin with. I mean, for many, people of color, Black and Indigenous peoples, this country has always been, just a dangerous, traumatizing place. Our daily lives can be potentially traumatic because of the racism that permeates every system and institutions in this country, including the educational system. Right. And so we are not, in addition to that, we are not just worried about the racism that we might directly face, but we are also burdened by the racism that our ancestors faced. Right. So there's historical racism as well. There's historical trauma as well, and the effects of historical trauma, is very real. They are tangible. They can literally kill us, right? So we are affected by both contemporary racism and historical racism, and the resulting worries and anxieties and paranoia and depression and sense of helplessness, sense of hopelessness, sense of defeat. They are still very damaging to us. It damages our well-being, our self-esteem, our mental health, our physical health, our ability to do our jobs, our ability to do our schoolwork, our ability to go to school. So if we truly, genuinely want to be culturally responsive, right, then we must address the racism in all aspects of society, because it is the racism that really affects peoples of color every day. But in our schools, our true history is not just forgotten or erased. It is even distorted, and it's distorted in a way that dehumanizes us. Right. So for our schools, then, if we truly, genuinely care about our students' well-being and school performance, then we will prioritize addressing racism, because, it is the root of why so many students are struggling.
Hey, Ian, I want to hear from you on this as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would second the points EJ made. I mean, it was a brilliant commentary, and I'd only add that I think when thinking about history, you can go down a couple different pathways here. And I think when we're trying to impart a narrative on students, there's maybe two separate ways that I see this going too often. And the first way which is to just really do violence to students by not talking about certain things, or not really talking about the history of racism, the history of land theft, the history of slavery, all of this. And it's and that happens. And I think it's a huge risk. And I think that's something that we need to be aware of, and just kind of as basic cultural competency, move away. On the other hand, I do sometimes, I wonder if we have to, you have to teach the history of racism and the foundations of the country, but you also have to teach resistance and resilience. And so, I think when we're trying to really grapple with history and grapple with trauma, we want to be careful to emphasize the history of racism and systemic racism and the way in which these structures kind of loop through the past and into the present. But we also need to be very careful, I think, to highlight resistance to those same systems, and to really make sure that those who have resisted are at the forefront of a narrative. I mean, but by all means, we talk about slavery, but we talk about Nat Turner, right? We just had the Democratic National Convention. We talk about the history of racism in politics, but we talk about Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So I think there's an opportunity there to do both of these things at once, which is to engage a serious, substantive discussion about race and trauma, but to also do so in a way that allows for that empowerment. And I think that's really, institutionally, at least, I think that's what we can do. Individually, I hope we can do that as well. But that would be, I think, maybe a good place to start.
Well, that's the blessing of George Floyd. For a while, I was beginning to feel that I was a dinosaur going around talking about there is racism, and people were telling me, no, that was back in your day, Cal. racism has been resolved. But then after people witnessed that 8 minutes and 40 seconds, they started saying, well, perhaps racism does exist. And the door of conversations have been open again. I've lost friends in having that conversation, but they were obviously associates and not friends. I welcome the conversation.
Yes. Before we move on, I wanted to see if there were any other thoughts from our panelists, because I want to, trauma is coming up, and I want to talk about the trauma that is associated with this.
Can I say something for 30 seconds, Kristina?
Please do. Please do. This is a conversation.
As Margo, Cal, and Ian mentioned, I think seeing oneself and one's own group and one's own people in the curriculum, whether it be history, science, arts, literature, that's psychologically powerful, right? It is definitely empowering. It lets, people know, students know that they are, a big part of this country, a big part of this world, that they and their ancestors and their people, have significantly contributed, right? And have resisted and have won and have succeeded. As Ian mentioned, that's empowering, so it helps psychologically. But in addition to all of that, I think it also, an accurate and critical understanding of history also allows people to see the connections between themselves and other cultural groups, right? That you all struggled, we struggled, this people, all the way from across the world struggled, and the struggles are similar, right? What are we all fighting against, right? So it actually can build, or actually can spark like unity and solidarity and collaboration between different groups of people as well. So it can be empowering in that sense also.
Absolutely.
Kristina, I just wanted to chime in, like, the nature of knowing one's true authentic self is not a point in time, right? It's also a process that people are going through at every stage of one's life. I mean, it's still revealing to ourselves, even as adults. I mean, a lot of folks whose history wasn't necessarily connected to their childhood are searching in their adulthood, right? So assessing one's true and authentic history and culture, I just think is the grace for learning about that, I think, is important. And I just keep going back to as I keep hearing the difference between our capacity to be responsive and the rigidity of the past, right? And so I just really believe that there's a great opportunity here for us to think of this as a reset conversation, especially through the lens of recognizing that it is really multiple realities that make up our collective truth. And so the space for those experiences and those truths to live and to be heard and seen do matter for the conversation and for recognition and for healing. But we have the capacity to have the room now. So it really isn't, in my mind, a question of can we achieve this. It really is about whether or not we're going to commit to doing the work of recognizing that that's where we are in the space of learning and growth.
So I will say, I will ask a question. I will ask this question though, and then I'll come right back to you, Cal. So, and I'm, again, as an educator, I learned about the common school error, right? I learned about how public education became a thing in this country, and it was not to provide opportunity to all. It was to sort, right? Wealthy landowners' kids got free education. If you had any kind of mental incapacity or were the wrong color or of the wrong caste, you were sent to institutions, and the rest of the kids didn't get an education. It wasn't for them. And so, George, you mentioned putting a square peg in a round hole. And so there's this part of me as an educator that's like, until we blow this up and build it back differently, right? We're going to continue coming into this consistent struggle because we are perpetuating a system that was never built for anything other than white kids, because that was what it was built on, right? So, there's this part of having to tear down to build up. However, there's also this part with having to understand those systems of oppression, understand the interconnected nature of them, and to be strategic about breaking them down. So it's not just blow up to blow up, right?
Right.
I mean,
right. Let me chime into just to piggyback right off of you. The way I see it is the difference between the assembly line education or on demand. The ability to be relevant on demand to where our students are today is we have that capacity. At one point in time, you may have not had that capacity, so it was maybe a function of also the limitations that it was the assembly line was essentially driving conformity, right? And conformity was the high value of the assembly line because every product kind of is going to look the same. You're going to leave. And so the diversity of recognizing the different ways that people learn, let alone how they grow, was never really core to the component of pedagogy at that point. So I think your point is well taken. But now the difference is between conforming or empowering. And when we talk about culturally responsive and we talked about adapting educational models now, we're essentially talking about being on the edge of empowering our students rather than having them be on a conforming assembly line production.
So if we could go to the next slide. Go ahead, Cal.
I was just wanted to say that we had a Freedom House over on Carlick Street between 13th and 14th back in 1968. And young people used to meet over there daily and read Soul on Ice, Seize the Time, the Black Panther movement, Che Guevara, etc. We had that in this town at one point, right there back in the 60s.
So that community, and how long was that around, Cal? That was...
Well, for about 2 years. The house that we had now is that house on Carlick where you see the chicken coops there. That used to be called the Freedom House. Jacoby Kawazi, Cal Williams, Herb Hilton, who had the movement. Wow, God, I'm having a blank here. But at any rate, we had the NAACP. Oh, Matthew A. Henson, the Matthew A. Henson Society, and the Black Caucus later came along. But prior to all of that, we had these groups, radicals though we were, reading those kind of materials and learning our history and our culture and sharing it and challenging each other. Man, you haven't finished the book yet? What's wrong with you? So.
Right, and I grew up with that culture of meeting and of sharpening and refining in our community through the challenge of our own intellect with the readings and books. So yeah, it's about community and freedom schools. There is a model of that. Thank you, Cal, for bringing that up.
Yeah. And we're going to move on to this next question because I really want to get some different voices into this. So Anne, I want to start with you and thinking about, culturally responsiveness and thinking about the SEL work that you helped birth in the Anchorage School District and really in the state and helping to bring light to trauma and trauma-informed practices. How do you find that environments that are not just sensitive to SEL, which is social emotional learning, right? And trauma, how do you find that these culturally responsive environments support both the students and teachers? And I'll say students and teachers for you, and then Margo, I'm going to come to you for more of a workplace, organizational culture flavor to this question. So we'll start with you, Anne.
Thanks, Kristina. If it's all right, I'd like to just hop back for a moment to the sort of strategies conversation that we were having earlier, because I've heard so many people speak to the need for students to really see themselves at school and in our learning. And so I'd put in a plug for everywhere, but certainly in Anchorage, in our very multicultural district, to truly develop ethnic studies courses and make them reflective of the histories that are carried in our district and make them count for credit. And to do to truly develop ethnic studies courses, they have to be developed by people within that community. So that means recruiting, hiring, sustaining, supporting teachers who are Black teachers, Indigenous educators, people of color across the board, so that our school district looks more like our population and speaks to that. So I'm going to now pivot quickly, because I know that was a lot of conversation there.
You're good. You're good.
Social and emotional learning. It has been around for 25 years, and thankfully is evolving. Social emotional learning is really it's a habit of practice. It's a lifelong process for developing and nurturing competency in the ways that we know and share ourselves, and how we understand and interact with others. And currently the work around social emotional learning is really talking about transformative SEL, and Dr. Rob Jakers and others in a paper in this last year have talked about transformative SEL is a process where students and teachers build strong, respectful relationships founded on an appreciation of similarities and differences, learn to critically examine root causes of inequity, and develop collaborative solutions to community and social problems. So to do that, Kristina, you asked me to think about both students and adults. And really, what we need is very, very much the same for both. We need opportunities for self-reflection, self-awareness, thinking about who are we, where do we come from, what am I bringing with me, how is what I'm doing impacting others, and to really do that as human beings in a shared educational environment. I'm going to stop there because there's so much.
No, thank you.
And you can use
Kristina.
non-degree.
Yes.
You can use.
Hold on, Celeste.
Oh my goodness! Now you see why I only took 30 seconds for that intro, because I knew that this was going to be
we were going to go
conversation that we all wanted to hear.
Yes.
You should see this chat blowing up.
I know.
And the Facebook page is going off the chain, and I'm sitting here just, I want to talk about my educational lack thereof when it comes to Black history. So I mean. But we're our time is like up now. But I just want to say this. Oh, let's just agree to go to 8:15. I mean, we can go to 8:15.
I can do that.
More minutes, and then so keep going. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for being the timekeeper. Go ahead, Cal.
Well,
you were up next. Go ahead.
Well, let me say to Ann, we've heard all these years, we can't find those people and they don't apply. And, we can't help with, where do we get them from? In the meantime, use lay people, bring in traditional healers, etc., to allow these students to have access. And then wait for Godot, for the real deal to come along. But in the meantime, let me and others go into the schools and have access, Zoom or whatever, and give them the moral stories that I have written that gives lessons on nonviolence, honesty, integrity, not bullying, etc. I've written these stories. I present them in performance and stuff. And there are many other people who do that same kind of work. Give us access.
I'm going to say, what Cal's saying is true. Just consider the nature of how many artists, how many diverse specialists are brought into the classroom to add value to lessons. So now we're not talking about adding value. We're talking about fundamentally embedding it at the core level, right? Intentionally at the core level. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And pay them for it.
That's right.
That part. Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. No, I understand, because, and I say that not to be pessimistic or anything like that, but I say that because oftentimes, I've experienced that myself as a person of color. People they always want you to volunteer your time or can you come do this? And we can't, but really, when people have a skill set that you need, and if you have the means, as a professional, they should be compensated. And so, and I say that as Kristina, a small business owner in the state of Alaska, and someone who has volunteered and will continue to do that, throughout the community. But I do see that there is a distinct difference of that being the mode of approach for people of color versus non-people of color. In my professional lived experience, I have witnessed that. Now, I want to go back to this question, and I want to bring Margo into the question because I want to talk about this in the workplace, right? So now we're not talking necessarily about students and teachers, we're talking adult to adult. So can you talk to us about how you've seen these intentional culturally responsive environments be beneficial for the adults and the relation and the culture of organizations that you've served in?
Sure, it's a great question. One of the things I enjoyed most, prior to retiring, was the opportunity to work with adults, not just to solve problems relative to discrimination, harassment, that kind of thing, but to also help staff build environments that were welcoming, where people felt like they belonged, where they shared a common, they just shared, they were the value of sharing, and commonalities were what was really important. So adults, just like the kids, they need opportunities to engage. We build relationships with each other, talk about how things are going. Jackson, you have to wait. So I think it's more, we want the same thing for our adults that we want for our kids. And that is a respectful environment where they feel valued. Our teachers I believe our teachers do a great job with SEL. It's ongoing. It includes all of the kids. Communication, not just communicating to be talking, but communicating in ways where people feel like they are part of the conversation. So whatever language, we always talk about how many languages we speak. But we also have to be real careful and make sure that not only are we value that, but we've also got to support that. We've got to support how we are communicating, and communicate with our families and in a way that they really want to, in the language they want to be communicated in. The other thing is, just making sure building relationships, whether those relationships are student to student, teacher to teacher, student to bus driver, whatever it is. We all have to share that common language, share that common goal. And that way, I think our environments, until we get people who look like our kids, I think we are on the path through SEL and through other programs that we have going on. I just want to see them more community. The same language that ASD is speaking needs to somehow make its way home.
Yeah.
And make its way into the bigger community.
Mm-hmm. Which speaks to, access, right? And thinking critically about how do we examine. I think one of the questions we had earlier was about looking at the barriers that are in place in some of these systems, and then how do we create more access. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to deviate from the script a little bit with the panel. We're going to forego the last question, and I want to just dig into the chat here so that I can see if we have any additional questions that have not been answered. We have defined race and culture there. I think we've given some examples here on for the educators. How would you use, I'll just ask this one out loud, and educators, if you wanted to add anything to, I think all of us are educators. Our lived experience and the way that we have positioned ourselves in this conversation, we're just as much educators as we are learners when it comes to being culturally responsive. So this one here at about 7:29 says, how would you use culturally responsiveness and differentiation in your classrooms? giving some examples of what that would look like, and adjustments or changes to curriculum, if any. So is there anyone who'd like to add anything to what they've previously said?
Well, I'd like to see history. I'd like to see, right now we have Alaska Studies. I'd like to see Black history and ethnic studies as part of our, it somehow infused, embedded in our curriculum. And I just think that until we do that, I mean, that's just one thing, but it's a big thing, because not only do we have to look at just the history, the content of it, but preparing the adults who teach it to be able to
support it,
to be able to get the information they need to be able to be more effective in teaching it.
You know, one of the things when we talk about at the Humanities Forum, the C3 program and the Creating Cultural Competency, we have the relationship between a community and the identity of a community is more clearly defined than because we have teachers coming from outside of rural Alaska to rural Alaska, where there's a clear bridge of understanding that needs to be built. What we have to have is recognition that we are a multicultural city. We are a diverse place. And so we have to really step back from normative. So I think the first and foremost thing is thinking about an inventorying of what does it really mean for ASD specifically to lean into cultural responsive curriculum, very specifically within our school district. And now that goes into the inventorying of our language, of the languages, of the various ways of learning, and giving them light so that people could begin to see the range of challenges. I think oftentimes we say there's over 100 languages spoken in a school district, but unless you really know what that means, it doesn't necessarily translate into a better understanding of the complexity that we have here. And so I just think that being clear about that is really important.
But not just Anchorage. This is Willow Elementary School for Black History Month in 1998. Willow Elementary. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, for me, I'm raising a Black son here in Anchorage, and it's one thing I think for us, and I disclose that I do work for the Anchorage School District. I'm not in this space as a director of curriculum and instruction. I'm here as a mom and a community member. But I think by and large in our city, we don't talk about race enough, and we don't talk about the systemic way in which we sometimes intentionally and unintentionally perpetuate these systems of racism and oppression on non-white people. So I guess it's great in my, thought process, it's great for us to say we have to have it in schools, but actually kids don't live in school, they live in communities. And so I think our community has to get bold and courageous about saying we are anti-racist, right? I should know coming to Anchorage, just as I knew moving to Seattle when I did do that in my iteration of self, that I was moving to a place that said through their systems and practices that they were anti-racist. Now, did that always pan out the way that we wanted it to? Absolutely not. But it was a bold and courageous community statement. And that's what I want for the city that birthed me. I want Anchorage to say, we are an anti-racist city that believes in the potential and the contribution of every person that lives in this place. And that part has been missing for me as an adult in Anchorage. And so that's why I think that it's bigger than just our district. I think it's we as a people have to say, this is how we want to move forward. This is how we want to make change. So I'm going to go back to the questions because I want to make sure that I am doing what I said I was going to do. Go ahead, George. I know you have something to say.
I was just, I was going to say that's exactly right. And so the way that Cal brought up the Freedom School, I want to remind folks that the elements of what we're talking about, the foundation, the roots are here too. And so you have a group like the Bridge Builders who've been around for a while, whose in their mission is to help make Anchorage the city that ends racism and prejudice, right? So the elements are here, to your point, but I just wanted to bring us back to the Black Lives Matter era, and very specifically because there's a lot of folks that are going to have various ways to read and to connect to that. But I just wanted to read. I wanted to read something that I think helps me land this. And this is Matthew 25:42 to 45. Okay, so it's a biblical reference. For when I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat, I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you did not look after me. When did we see you, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger in needing of clothing or sick or in prison and did not help you? And the answer was, truly, I will tell you, when you did not do for the one of the least of these, you did not do for me. So when we talk about the call of Black Lives Matter,
there it is.
I just want people to remember that we're essentially saying, this is a call for a health check of the system based on the least of these, which is a biblical
right.
value.
Right.
Little Sunday action.
And you know, well, I just want to thank everyone.
I want to keep going, Celeste,
because it is like almost 8:30 now.
Who cares?
I know, huh? Because you know what? I think, well, here's what I know. We need a part 2. We need a part 2. So Margo, let's set it up for the part 2. Okay, we'll get that going, and we'll see that come in September. But Dr. Kristina, if you want to just share your final. I will. No, and my final really is just to thank everyone for taking time out of their Sunday to intentionally get uncomfortable a little bit, right? And to learn some things and to hear from our panelists who all bring very unique perspective to this work. This is human work. This is not about checking a box. It's not about a risk assessment or any other kind of checkboxy thing that you can do. This is people work that requires some individual eyes on how we function as our own individuals and how we create opportunities to experience the humanness and the brilliance of those around us. So again, thank you all so much. Thank you to the panelists, and I just want to wish you all good night. And we will be back. Well, okay, so Margo, did you?
Yes. So in my, I want to thank everybody again. But in my efforts to respond to some of your questions, I posted one of my emails in the chat box. So just ignore it and have a lovely evening. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our weekly conversations. This was absolutely fabulous. Check out our Facebook page. Please go to our website. There is more to come, and be sure to join us on September 7th for the March on Alaska at the Anchorage Town Square, 1:00 p.m. Again, look for the information on our website and Facebook page. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. This was a night to remember and so full of education. I still want my Black history. I want to know about me. Don't get me started. We got to go though, right? Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.